今私はパークスビルにありますパークスビルミュージアムに来てます。ここね、鍛冶小屋なんですけど、なんとここに鍛冶屋さんがいらっしゃるということで訪ねてみました。鍛冶屋さん、ブラックスミス鍛冶屋さんの、デイブさんです。今日はどうぞよろしくお願いします。
よろしくお願いします。
I've never seen like this. So can you tell me what exactly the place is this?
Yeah, this is a blacksmith shop, which means it's a place where someone can heat iron in the fire and hammer it on an anvil to shape it. That's called blacksmithing. And this shop is one of only two in Canada that is built like a traditional Japanese swordsmith shop. I started trying to make knives when I was about 13 years old because we did a social studies unit in school about Japan, and the museum in our town had a special exhibit all year about Japanese swords. So at that age, I already, I think, was captured by the fact that they're weapons and tools, but they're also very artfully made. So it's a warrior's blade, but it will have a little silver botan on the fuchi. It's just a very interesting combination of beauty and function. So I don't know if I was thinking that when I was 13, but I recognize that there's something different about Japanese swords compared to all the other sword traditions in the world. So that was my start many, many years ago. And I learned to blacksmith in Ohio, in Amish country, working with another blacksmith when I was 14 and 15. Because when I was 13, I had no money to buy steel, so I started by using old farm equipment from my grandparents' farm. So I've kind of just continued that tradition. Instead of making my own steel, I like the idea that I can recycle or take something that someone looks at and says, that's not good for anything, and change it into this with only a hammer so that they can't even believe that it's the same thing, right? So that's the biggest difference, I would say. Everything else is the same though. I'm using stones that came out of the ground, I'm using charcoal, urushi comes from a tree, so everything is the same as it would have been. Yeah. The problem is I have to do it all myself. That's the other big difference. Is that in Japan it would be like 8 different craftsmen to do each step, but here I've just had to learn everything myself. So for about the last 10 years, I spent my time doing one of two things, either trying to make the best example of a classical style tanto, something that you might see in a museum from the 14th century in Japan, or making smaller knives that are made for people to go camping and using all of the same proportion and design and materials. So those are the two kinds of knives I've been making. And one thing I try to do is to use only the materials that would have been used 500 years ago. So that means no glue, no epoxy. Instead of wood glue, I use sokui, which is rice glue. So everything, I try to make it as close as I can to a historical piece. Even for the knives that people use for camping, they have only natural materials. Rice glue, urushi made from a tree. So it takes me a long time, but there are people who want that kind of work. So, in addition to using as much traditional materials, I also tried to use traditional tools the same. So I don't use any machine to polish or shape the blades. I don't use a propane forge or a welder, any of those things. The fire is charcoal, and when I need to shape the blade, I use the hammer and finish it as close as I can. And then for polishing, I use the stone, hand stone, use a file for shaping it, so it's very slow. But there are people who want something that looks the way I make it with the materials that I use, and they want to pay me for all the time it takes to do it by hand from start to finish. So when I'm starting a knife, I will first try to find something that will work for the steel. A lot of what I use is old farm equipment or like horse-drawn carriage springs from 100 years ago. The oldest steel that I can find is what I want because it has the best characteristics compared to a traditional Japanese sword. So I start with something that's old and it's usually crusty. And then using just the fire and the hammer on the anvil here, I'll shape it as close as I can to the finished knife. So this surface is only hammer work, just by hammering. There's no polishing it. You can hold it.
Oh, okay.
So that the closer that you can get it with the hammer, the less time you have to spend filing or polishing because you're not wasting any material. So when I decided to stop using power tools, it forced me to get really good at forging with the hammer because it takes a lot longer to shape it without a machine, right?
Can't do just oops and
Yeah, one oops and you have to change the whole project. Yeah. So after the blade and the parts are made, then I'll start carving the scabbard and the handle and fitting all of the pieces together. So this one has some new parts that I've made, and it also has some old parts that are from the Edo period that came off of old swords that were lost. So that's the next step, and then the final step is to finish polishing the blade and lacquer this with urushi. And when that's all done, then something that not everybody knows about the Japanese sword is that there's a peg in the handle. It's usually bamboo, or sometimes it's horn. But if you take the peg out, the whole knife comes apart. Every piece comes off, one by one. So you can't glue the knife together because all the pieces have to come off, and then you can polish the blade. So that's another reason that it takes a long time to make, because everything has to fit perfectly together.